speaker tonight is a great friend of mine. Evelyn and I met each other, actually, I think about 16 years ago this week-ish, in an ill-fated attempt to reclaim the Marshall Plan one beer at a time, courtesy of the German Ministry of Defense. We did not succeed, but we became friends and have worked together and known each other since that time. Evelyn currently is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council of the United States, but prior to that, she was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, Eurasia, responsible for policy in the Department of Defense towards Russia, the Black Sea, the Balkans, the Caucasus regions. Prior to that, she had just sort of a tremendous DC resume. She worked for an upstart think tank that I'm very fond of. She also was the executive director. She's the executive director of the Commission on the Prevention of Weapons of Mass Destruction, Proliferation, and Terrorism. I always kept an eye on Evelyn when the news got a little bit sketchy. I figured if she left town, I would follow her. Prior to that, she worked for Senator Carl Levin on the Senate Armed Services Committee, and prior to that was at the Marine Corps Command and Staff College. She is an accomplished author. She's been prominently featured on MSNBC, CNN. Pick your favorite network, she's been on it. And she has published extensive op-eds, including several in the last few months, taking a very critical look at administration policy towards Russia and the role that Russia has played in the presidential campaign. We're going to spend a little time talking about those issues tonight. Evelyn's going to say a few words. I'll ask a few questions, and then I'll do the Jimmy Fallon impersonation and run around and get as many questions from the audience as you have tonight. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Evelyn Farkas.
Thank you very much, Jim. I don't know, I have a mic on, which may not be on.
Mic is working.
Okay, all right, so I'll use the podium mic. So first of all, I didn't realize that I was actually going to be sort of the last speech in your series. And so I feel a little bit badly because I don't think I'm going to bring anyone a lot of joy and peace and good feelings leaving this series. So it might be a little bit more doom and gloom and things to worry about. I was walking around Newport earlier today, and I'm going in and out of the shops, and I happened to mention, that I was here with the Pell Center and I was going to give a talk, and I said to the shopkeeper, well, it's about Russia if you're interested. And she looked at me and I said, why we should be concerned about Russia? And she said, oh, no, I don't want to know why I should be concerned about Russia. So I think that you are a very brave lot because you are all very motivated. You're here on this cold December evening to hear about why you should worry about Russia and what we should do about it. So what I wanted to do, because Jim, I like this format, I love the Q&A, and I love the fact that I'm going to get questions from all of you. So what I thought I would do is just lay the foundation, provide some basis for discussion so that we would kind of get some things out of the way. And what I mean by that is I want to give you my kind of two fundamentals, I guess, how I perceive Russia. And I kind of come at it with a pretty hard-edged perspective. So in my view, Russian objectives, generally speaking, the Russian government's objectives are not lined up with the U.S. government's objectives. And we can talk about that because I said generally. So it's not across the board, and there are areas where we can work with Russia. But generally speaking, our objectives do not line up. We do not share the values of the Kremlin. And Russia is no longer a status quo power. And that's actually very important. The way that the Russian government has been behaving, especially since 2014 or 2008, you can pick your date, but in any event, over the last several years, has not been as if Russia is a status quo power. And again, we can delve into what that means. I want to just share with you what I think the Kremlin's main objectives are. And sometimes I'll say Putin and I'll say the Kremlin. It's the same thing. It's a Russian government run by a very small group of people with one main decision maker, which is Vladimir Putin. The objectives of Putin and his Kremlin are, one, to keep him in power, and that means to maintain the autocratic, false democracy in Russia, so the political system, the autocratic political system, as well as his economic mafia-style crony capitalism. So it's not a free market capitalism, again, mafia, crony mafia-style economic system. The Kremlin also wants to demonstrate that Russia is a global power on par with the United States and our allies. And unfortunately, the way that they have come to demonstrate that is not through cooperation most of the time, but through confrontation. The third objective that Putin and the Kremlin have is to rewrite the rules of the international system. And what do I mean by that? Mainly to rewrite them so that the international community cannot intervene in sovereign states in order to protect the citizens of that state from their despotic rulers. And that comes into play when you look at Syria, for example. And then there are two sort of subordinate objectives that the Kremlin has. One is to control its geographic periphery, that means Eastern Europe and Central Asia, control it economically and politically. They don't need to control all the territory, although, as you well know, they have invaded and seized parts of their neighbors' territory. They also would like, if possible, to break the transatlantic unity, the alliances between us and the Europeans, specifically NATO, but also the European Union. The Russian government, the Kremlin, sees that as a challenge to their desire to have power throughout Europe and perhaps globally as well. And then I think I just want to say one word about the Russian means, because I just told you what I see as their objectives. The biggest problem, of course, are their means. You know, we could live with a Russia that wants to demonstrate that it's a global power on par with the United States. In and of itself, that objective is not a problem. However, it's the means that they use to achieve these three main objectives. And the means include political subversion, economic subversion, intimidation, invasion and occupation of their neighbors, lies and propaganda. The list is so long I have to look at my paper. Weaponizing or dumping refugees. These are terms that they haven't used, but what I mean by that is the weaponizing term was used actually by the military head of NATO, the Supreme Allied Commander. He talked about Russia weaponizing refugees going from Syria to Germany. The Finnish foreign minister talked about dumping refugees because other refugees who had been in Russia for quite some time from Central Asia and Afghanistan were encouraged to go into Finland, Norway, and some of the other Nordic states. Essentially, what they do with all this, and then there's the pressure you probably know about their oil and gas. They have a near monopoly in Europe, although that's changing now, but they've used that monopoly to put pressure on the governments. And the idea is through all these means, none of them good, they have essentially applied a veto to the sovereign decision-making of the countries in Europe in particular. And the reason I think this is a problem is that if Russia perceives that this is a successful policy, if the Russian government perceives that using these means in order to achieve those objectives is working, they'll keep on doing it. And ultimately that is a challenge to the United States, because we see even where they use some of these means, like funding political NGOs on the far right and the far left, or political parties, I should say, also funding NGOs. They use those means also in Western Europe, in countries where we have allies. They probably try them in the United States. There's certainly Russia Today, which is a television network, global, including in the United States, that the Russian government uses in order to spread its lies and propaganda. So my bottom line is the reason we should worry about Russia is because they're using these means to achieve these objectives, and if they're not stopped, they'll continue to do this. And therefore, my formula, my solution, I'm going to get to the punchline right now, is I think we need to stand united with our European and other allies worldwide against Russia with a defensive policy. So not offensive, but a defensive policy that's a combination of military deterrence and other deterrence, but deterrence, strengthening our allies and our partners, especially throughout Europe, but again elsewhere. You see there are tensions in Asia and elsewhere as well. And then communicating the truth. That's very important, so that the Russian narrative, the kind of the propaganda and the lies and the confusion that they spread, that the government spreads, that is responded to, that we, or even better, that we already have a narrative out there before they start giving us their take on things. So that's kind of the very basic, what do I think the Russian government wants, how do I think that they're trying to get it, and what should we do? So with that, I am ready for all of your questions.
Super. So we got fancy new microphones here. Can you hear me? Yes. Good. All right. So I noticed, and Evelyn and I chatted before, and I said, Evelyn, you're going to sit on that side. You will notice that we've reversed the Chiron. You know that I am Jim Ludus, and that is Evelyn Farkas. I'm sure there won't be any confusion as the night proceeds. Does your microphone work?
I believe so. Can you all
Here,
hear me?
Evelyn? Yeah?
Okay, good.
Okay. So, Ev, when you say Russia's no longer a status quo power, what does that mean?
So status quo powers, they agree, they subscribe to the rules of the road, the international rules of the road. That means territorial sovereignty, the UN Charter. You don't intervene unless there's a threat to international peace and security. Usually that intervention, that military intervention, comes after a UN vote, although we know that we, in certain instances, have gone in and military intervened without such a UN resolution. But nevertheless, first and foremost, I think it's territorial sovereignty. But I would also say minority rights, human rights, subscribing to those principles, the Helsinki principles that Russia signed up to. And it's basically just acceptance of the international order. But the Russian government has been telegraphing to us, I mean, they sound actually a lot like this political candidate who, one of our political candidates who doesn't like the rules, and says the rules are bad. And so I don't want to go too far with that parallel because I don't want to upset people who are politically, I don't want to get Russia mixed up in our domestic politics too much. But the point is that this Russian government is not, they don't accept the international rules. They want to rewrite them. They want them to go according to Russia's, what works best for Russia.
And are they making progress?
They're making progress in challenging the rules, but they have not succeeded in rewriting them. And it's interesting because people have said, and I think even your local journalist interviewed me, said, well, haven't they won? Right. And no, they haven't won. Yes, they hold territory. 20% of the state of Georgia in the Caucasus is occupied by Russian troops. Of course, they've seized Crimea, and you have Russian troops there. And you have in eastern Ukraine also Russian occupation. You have Russian troops, about 2,000 of them in Moldova, a small country next to Romania. You have Russian troops in Armenia, although those troops are there more or less with the sovereign government's approval and agreement. Yeah. But again, having troops in countries against the will of those countries, that's the biggest example. That's the biggest problem.
How deep-seated a policy is this? Is this, you gave the rundown of why you think that why they're behaving this way. Does this change if Putin's no longer in charge?
That's a very good question. I think that, first of all, Putin will be there. He'll have elections in 2018. Right. He's going to see to it that he gets reelected. How will he do that? He could rig the elections. He could just keep up the propaganda, keep up the military adventurism in order to distract the people, because the economic situation is not going to get better between now and the elections. But between now and the elections is not that much time. He can probably win. That means he's there till 2024. Right. And even if he were to leave right now, the people who are around him, the kind of heir apparents, they don't have a strong opposition. Yeah. So the people around him would probably take power, and they're not that different from him.
Yeah. I guess the question that I've pondered about is simply, is there a deep-seated cause for conflict between Russia and the West?
There shouldn't be. But again, right now, because Putin is trying to use force and use all the subversion and all the tactics I mentioned in order to put a veto on the sovereignty of these states that want to become democratic, want to join the European Union. The whole problem with Ukraine was that the Ukrainian government decided they were going to join the EU. Well, right. They went back and forth, and then there was a demonstration because the government ultimately said, okay, you're not going to join the EU under Russian pressure. We're not going to join the EU. And the people went on the streets and said, yes, we are. Because the youth in Ukraine, they want the change. They want the move towards the West. So they're trying to put a veto on the decisions of sovereign countries. But it's more than that. Putinism, the way I mentioned that they govern in Russia, this very autocratic, it's autocratic. It's not democratic. There's a veneer of democracy. Yeah. And then the economic situation, which is rampant. There's rampant corruption. It's not a free market economy. They would like to have that system prevail in the neighboring countries, and certainly they'd be happy to see it in Western Europe as well, because they can use their influence. And they're already trying to use influence here and there in the West.
So I could do this all night, but I am going to open up the floor to questions in a few minutes. So as you're thinking of those questions, I'll come around in a few. Just raise your hand. I'll come to you with a microphone, and we'll get the questions. When you mentioned that it's a complex relationship between the United States and Russia. Lots of areas where there's disconnect. A few areas where there is alignment. Could you identify a few of those?
So the areas where we have alignment, number one, I think on non-proliferation, it's clear that Russia has always been concerned about proliferation of nuclear weapons in particular, but also chemical and biological. And we've been able to work with Russia even through the Cold War, and then most recently in the case of Iran, stopping their nuclear programs. And so where there are, that's one area where there's key interest. On arms control, that's come and gone, and I mean, it's hard to tell. Sometimes it appears stronger than at the moment. So in the early part of this Obama administration, we had the START agreement signed and a commitment to working on arms control. Today, I would say that looks very weak on the non-nuclear, so the conventional front, but also on the nuclear side, it doesn't look so good.
Is there validity to the concerns that have been expressed in the press about Russian cheating, whether it's on Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, the Intermediate Forces Treaty, any of the other?
Yes. Russia, first of all, they've violated the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which requires them, we banned that class of weapons, and so did the Russians.
Right.
And that happened in the 80s under Reagan, and we threatened to actually deploy these intermediate nuclear missiles to Europe, and only then did the Russians back down. Now they're playing with fire because they've developed this intermediate nuclear weapon, and missile rather, which could be armed with nuclear weapons, and if they deploy it, then that's a huge problem. They're already in violation. Yeah. So we need to figure out a way to dissuade them and have them destroy that program. So, on the conventional front, you mentioned the Vienna document and the conventional force. The conventional forces Europe, they've withdrawn. And then on the Vienna document, which just requires countries to say, hey, I'm going to do an exercise in Germany with this number of troops, and don't worry, Russia and the world, we're just trying to make sure that we're ready, we have good military capability, we're ready in the case of some threat. Right. So it's transparency, it's confidence building, it's reassuring. The Russians, they do snap exercises, they don't announce them, they give very little announcement, and it's like all the way up to hundreds of thousands, which is above the allowed levels, but they'll call it 2 exercises because they'll say, well, we're doing it with Belarus, and there are some in Belarus and some in Russia, but it's the same exercise. Okay. And then twice they've used these snap exercises to actually invade. Right. In 2008 they invaded Georgia, and in 2011 they invaded Ukraine and seized Crimea. Right. So we are quite nervous about that. So that is absolutely counter to the arms control and what you're trying to do with those agreements.
Are they stepping back? Are they pulling back on their commitments here because it gives them greater operational flexibility, or is it part of a broader strategic shift that they're looking to do in terms of achieving some sort of advantage relative to the West?
I think it's both. I mean, I think that they first of all, they've developed what we saw in Crimea was this ability to send in, basically Russian special operations forces.
Little green men.
Little green men, somebody called them, the media called them that, or the Russians called them that. But they're paramilitary. They sent them in without insignia, right. So they weren't identified as regular Russian military forces. Sent them in. They seized buildings. They set up everything they needed to do. Brought the equipment in, and the Russians denied that they were behind it until about 2 weeks later when Putin couldn't, or maybe a month later, anyway, in the matter of weeks, Putin couldn't help himself, but he started bragging about it. But it was actually, from a military perspective, pretty impressive. They did this stealthily, they did it quickly, and we were all shocked. I mean, we were all surprised.
There was something too about the operational professionalism of those Russian special forces. I'm assuming they were cool customers. Their engagements with Western media, these guys were impressive as hell, quite frankly.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is, of course, in the case of Ukraine, it was a lot easier because it was right over the border.
Yeah.
You know, that's easier. The operation they did in Syria, they couldn't do in secret, you know, because that's further away.
So let's talk about Syria. So I'm intrigued, and maybe it was a function of time. Do you include Syria in the list of places where U.S. and Russian interests are in alignment?
I include Syria in the list of places where we are not in alignment.
Could you explain that?
Because basically Russia is there to back Bashar al Assad. He wants to keep the Syrian dictator, the Kremlin, Putin wants to keep the Syrian dictator in power. Why? Well, I mentioned already that they want to rewrite the international rules of the road so that you cannot intervene in a country like Libya, you know, or Bosnia or anywhere else to save the citizens from their brutal dictator. That matters to Putin, number one, because he had already good relationship with Syria. They have a port there now. They have a big air base there. So geostrategically, it's good. But also, Putin sees all these he calls them coups, but these changes in government because of the citizens' uprisings as a threat to himself. He thinks someday that could happen to him if he doesn't stop it in other countries. And in 2011, when he was reelected, there were actually demonstrations in Moscow and St. Petersburg. The other thing is that this is also a place where he can demonstrate, remember objective number 2 is show that Russia is a global power on par with the US and our allies, and in part that's by checking us. So that also works out nicely for him in the Syria context.
So is that a universally held perception inside the administration?
I would say that inside the administration, there is understanding about Russia's objectives, and that their objectives across the board are the ones that I outlined, maybe in different words. But in a given situation, they may not see things, and not everyone sees things the way that I do. So in the case of Syria, there's probably some debate about, but ultimately I actually think, if you ask me, my personal opinion is that there is room for a compromise with Russia on Syria. We just have to be also willing to compromise. And so far we actually have. We compromised on the timeline for getting rid of Assad. It's not right now or yesterday. It's unclear, but so we're flexible. We've demonstrated some flexibility. But the thing that we haven't done is fold up our tent and go home, which I think Putin was hoping maybe we would do.
So I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open the floor here. But, you know, so my own view is that the Obama administration, particularly in the second term, has viewed Russia as, to borrow our term, an indispensable partner in some of the thorniest diplomatic challenges that the administration has faced. Syria, Iran, principally. Is that a fair characterization? And is it the right approach for the administration to be on?
I don't think it's fair to say Russia was indispensable on Iran, although I say that having not participated in the actual nitty-gritty of the negotiations, and we don't know. We don't know. We won't know until the archives are opened or definitive, you know, accounts are put out there, because it could very well be that there was a moment when the whole thing was going to blow up and Russia actually came to the rescue. But I still don't believe that Russia was indispensable to that agreement. If the Russians had said, we hate that agreement, we would have found some other mechanism to get rid of the fissile material, which is what Russia's contributing mainly. But I think Russia, again, they also do care about non-proliferation. They had their own reasons for going along with this. On the Syria question, I think we allowed the Russians to become indispensable in the aftermath of Assad's use of chemical weapons, because the Russians came forward with this idea about help working together to get rid of the chemical weapons. So in that respect, they sort of were indispensable because they had this alternative policy solution or proposal. Now, I would say that probably we can avoid working with the Russians to solve Syria. So in that respect, in Syria, they probably are indispensable because or I don't know if indispensable is the right word, but we can't ignore them in the Syria context.
Right. So I'm going to open the floor to questions. I could keep talking to her all night and ask a ton of different questions, but let's open it up to the audience. If you've got a question, raise your hand, and I'll come running to you.
Are there any effective challenges to Putin's power in Russia right now?
Well, effective, no. He's pretty strong. If you believe the polls, he's also popular. Now, I think you probably should take Russian polls with a grain of salt, because even if it's not the government knocking on the door, if you're a Russian citizen and someone's knocking on your door with all the history that they have there, I don't know that I would really tell the truth. But the opposition to Putin right now tends to be the intelligentsia, so the educated, intellectuals in Moscow and St. Petersburg. You did see, though, recently some opposition. The truck drivers got mad about a toll road that was being built, and the beneficiary of the toll road was a Putin crony, an old buddy of his from St. Petersburg. There was, I think there was another local, there are a couple of these local demonstrations, but what ends up happening is that the local officials get blamed. And so, for example, today there was a call-in show that Putin had out in central Russia, and the people, came with their complaints. And they were bragging in the Russian media about how the last time they had one of these complaint sessions, Putin went and fixed the problem. So there was back pay that some workers didn't get, and he fixed the problem. So what they do is they make it seem as if what the local officials or the governors are doing has nothing to do with Putin, and he can come in and solve it for the people. But actually, Putin installed the governors. All those local people are his cronies. But they have this kind of weird... it's a farce, in effect, but the people generally seem to be willing to go along with it.
With some of the economic difficulties that Russia is experiencing, how are they able to do all this expansion and, redeveloping the military and moving into all these countries?
Yeah. So they had a pretty good fund. They had a good amount of money coming in when the oil prices were high, and they were at 100 or more a barrel. They're down now. They're somewhere around 30, 40. So the Russians had to actually redo their entire budget. They had to cut back, including most recently on defense. They cut back 5%, which is a big deal for them. It's half of what they cut back across the board everywhere else, in areas that were already squeezed. So they don't have as much money, but they've made defense a priority, and they've made all of these, their military adventures, they've prioritized those things. So I wouldn't say that they can afford them, but they've decided to afford them.
Yeah, just a small question there. Whereas we might all agree with the complaints and the fears and concerns that we may have about Putin, he still gets away with it. What have we done other than talk to stop that? Or when are we going to try and stop it, if it is indeed such a concern?
Okay, so that's a good question. First of all, I think the most effective thing we've done, there's diplomacy, there's military means, there's economic means, and then there's talking. I think the most successful thing that we've done so far is the sanctions. And in large part, those are the sanctions in the Ukraine context, and those have probably worked. They've been amplified by the sinking oil prices. But the sanctions are targeted at people who support Putin. So it means that they can't get access, they and the banks that they depend on can't get access to Western capital. They can't travel because our sanctions are linked with the EU sanctions. So there's a travel ban on individuals and their companies. A lot of these Russians own property in Europe. Their families, they send their families to school. I mean, you probably know all this. But anyway, so the sanctions are one way. They take time, of course, but I think they are feeling the impact of the sanctions. On the military side, it's the deterrence. It's shoring up our NATO allies. So you see the president in 2014-15, he spent about $1 billion on exercises in the NATO context and putting some equipment in. The new initiative that he has for fiscal year 2017, it's 4 times the amount that he had before. And the administration's moving towards 1 and maybe even 2 rotational brigades. And now the nominee who might become, he's probably going to become the head of the U.S. European Command, he was already talking about permanent forces. So we see an increase of U.S. forces basically going back to Europe. And then outside of NATO, we gave $267 million of assistance to Ukraine after it was invaded. And there's now another 300 and something million that we're going to give them in addition. All that money is actually really important money. It goes towards training and equipping the Ukrainian military because they were, at the rock bottom because of the corruption that they had in their Ministry of Defense and their armed forces before. So those are some examples of things that we are doing, that the administration is doing, and I think we should do more of.
Got a question right here.
You've mentioned a couple of times that non-proliferation, nuclear non-proliferation, is an area where the U.S. and Russia have common interests and cooperation is possible. What about combating international terrorism?
Yes, see, that's an interesting one because, so I started working in the Pentagon as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense responsible for the relationship with Russia in August of 2012. And we talked a lot with the Russians. We should work on counterterrorism together. We can do a demining center. And when the current Minister of Defense in Russia came in 2013, I believe it was, or maybe end of 2012, he was very gung-ho. He said all these things about cooperating on counterterrorism. But, when the rubber hit the road, which I would say was Sochi, the Sochi Olympics, you would think that the Russians would want to cooperate with us on counterterrorism when it's their Olympics. And you know what? They really weren't that interested. They just talked a lot about it. And so that was already a sign for us that something was going on with Russia, even before their invasion of Ukraine, because they talked about cooperation, but they were really backing away from it.
So if you got a question, show me your hand. I'll come to you in just a second.
One of the lessons from South Korea and North Korea is, of course, we keep permanent forces there, not because they would really stop anything, because they're there. I'm thinking here of the Baltics and the Baltic states. And the idea that would you say that putting permanent forces there, American forces, boots on the ground, would be the appropriate approach that we should take? I imagine the states, as vulnerable as they are, they would be amenable to such a thing.
Yeah, the Baltic states are very excited. They would love your question because they are lobbying hard for U.S. and or NATO force. Well, not or. U.S. and NATO, but definitely U.S. forces in each of their states. And the administration has committed to putting some in rotationally, but they would like a permanent presence. I think that it would definitely deter Russia, and it would help us in terms of a NATO response. But you just have to make sure you keep in mind that the time-space distance means that if Russia wants to take some action against NATO, we would still probably have to go back and seize the territory. So you don't want to leave too much equipment, more than the people actually, vulnerable to Russia seizing it. But I do think that it's one way to deter Russia, and that's something they're looking at in the administration. The Baltic states would love, at least a battalion, if not, a brigade in each country. I think, this is something that's being discussed right now, and at the Warsaw Summit, the NATO summit that they're going to hold in Warsaw this June, or July, early July, you should expect to see an announcement about that.
My question is related to the last one, and maybe you already answered it. You mentioned Georgia and then Crimea and now the Baltic states. My question was, where do you have a feel for where Russia's next territorial expansion efforts would be?
I mean, if I knew that, I wouldn't be sitting here. I think I'd be on a yacht somewhere warm. Not because I know there are lots of here I could get on, but the thing with Russia is I can tell you that Putin will do something else to surprise us using military force. And the reason is because of the economic situation. So I didn't delve into it too much when I went into the fundamentals, but the reason we see really a ratcheting up of all of this militarism is that Putin came into power in 2000 with a bargain, and the bargain that he gave the people, the deal he made was, I'll give you a better standard of living, a better life, economically speaking. You'll get, you'll enjoy life more. You'll have material security. But in exchange, I'm going to rule this country, this federation, the way I need to, and I'm going to control everything. Now that the economic situation started to deteriorate, and that happened before 2014, it actually happened around, I think, the fundamentals of the Russian economy started to, and I'm not an economist, but 2011 or around the time that he was reelected. So Putin already saw that he was going to be in trouble. This bargain, he wasn't going to be able to keep up his end of the bargain over time. So in my view, and a lot of other experts' views, he switched horses. He switched to this nationalist horse because he thinks that's the one that's going to keep him in power now. That's the bargain he's giving the people. Now he's telling them, I'm making Russia great again. It might sound familiar. I'm making Russia great again, which, by the way, he isn't. But I'm making Russia great again. So, just put up with maybe, a little less chicken in your chicken soup, right? And the Russians are used to sacrifice in the name of some bigger cause, in the name of bigger Russia. So I expect he could do something in Afghanistan. I was worried. What I do is I look at what are they saying in the media. The Kremlin spokesperson, what is that person talking about? The Duma spokesperson, because they're actually really funny. The Russians, they're always trial ballooning. So before I left government in September, they were talking a lot about Afghanistan. I would hear Afghanistan. I thought, oh my, he's going to do something with Afghanistan. He did, but he ended up just sending arms, small arms to Afghanistan. But Afghanistan's a place where he could do something. He could do more in Ukraine. He is already ratcheting it up a little bit in the east, but I think that's not tied towards a new offensive. That's just tied towards making sure that there's no peace in the east. Because as long as there's fighting going on, it's hard for the Ukrainian government to take action on the things that they're supposed to do for the Minsk agreements. In Moldova, they have those forces there, and now it's harder for the Russian forces to get in and out because of Ukraine being a friendly border country. He could cause trouble there. In Georgia, he never stopped. So initially, the Russians said, oh, those two territories in Georgia called Abkhazia and South Ossetia, they're going to become independent countries, and world, you should recognize these countries. Except the world didn't, but the Russians kept pretending these are going to be new nation states. Well, last year, after Crimea, they started making movements to sign association agreements with these territory states, whatever they are. So they started actually taking power away from them, so making them almost like protectorates. Central Asia, there you have some governments that rely on strong men who are quite old. So if there's a change, Lavrov already said about Kazakhstan, it's not a real country. I'd be nervous if I was in Kazakhstan in some kind of position of political power. So the targets are all out there. I don't know how much we covered it in our media, but even in Germany, he put Merkel under pressure with the refugee situation, because there was all of a sudden, after she was put under pressure because of they found out that there was actual harassment of women by refugees in Cologne around New Year's. And the the German authorities had to admit it. And it caused a backlash against Merkel. Well, why are you welcoming these people when they treat women like this, right? And the Russians took advantage, because all of a sudden this story popped up about this 14-year-old girl named Lisa, who was an ethnic Russian German, and she had been, I guess, sexually abused or attacked by some refugees, and that was the story that was circulating. And for a while, it circulated, and Lavrov even said, oh, our Lisa, like he used that term, our Lisa, in a press conference. Well, it turned out it was a total fabrication. There was a girl named Lisa who was 14 who went off with some boyfriend she had and was holed up somewhere. So she had actually kind of disappeared, but she hadn't been abducted or assaulted by refugees. So that actually got Merkel's attention, and she called a commission to investigate the role and the kind of influence that the Russians are having in this kind of subversive way through these lies and propaganda. So that's a longer answer to your question. I embedded a lot of other stuff in there, but hopefully it helped.
In your plan to take on Russia, you emphasized defensive strength. But defensive sometimes varies in the eye of the beholder. Let me ask you about what we're doing and whether or not you consider it defensive. Not many NATO or American forces on very close to the Russian border a few years ago, and now rotating forces into Baltics, rotating forces into Romania and Poland, more ships in the Black Sea, more ships in the Baltic, with plans for increasingly moving our forces east in places that they haven't been for a long, long time. Is that defensive?
It is defensive. So it's because it's within NATO territory, it's within international waters, it's in response to Russia invading a neighboring country and seizing its territory. It's in response to, things that the Russians have said to the Baltic states or in that context about ethnic Russians being mistreated in the Baltic states. So it's a defensive move in response to Russian threats and Russian actions. Now, I will concede that to the Russians, legitimately, I mean, if I'm a Russian military leader, I am alarmed. I don't like that. But then don't invade your neighbors.
So we got some more questions. If you do have a question, raise your hand and I'll come to you. Ev, is it a new Cold War?
I don't think it's a new Cold War because it's different. I mean, today we're not in, our global environment is different. The biggest difference, I would say, is that, first of all, Russia's part of a global economy. So I mentioned that it's not a free market economy, but still they're part of a global economy. Russian citizens, the citizens of the Federation, are free to travel. They have access to the internet. Granted, it's not every Russian citizen, and it's not that widespread, and the Russian government is interested in learning from the Chinese and maybe reducing that access, but still, there's not the same environment that you have that you had during the Cold War. The other difference is that I would say that there, as I mentioned before, we're not opposed to Russia on every issue. So there are issues where we can work together, and I think there's more space for finding those issues, like Iran. And even, as I mentioned, in the context of Syria, we can end up working together, but how we get there, I don't know. So I would say it's not a Cold War. The way it is similar, the US and Russia, we still have 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. We still have a real interest in arms control, and as much as the Russians are trying to, as much as they're cheating and violating some of those agreements, by and large, I think if you had them sitting here today, they would concede that it does, they're not breaking out completely. So that's a similarity. And I think that's the main one.
How should world leaders respond to the allegations made in the Panama Papers about Putin being in a money laundering scheme?
Well, the Panama Papers pointed to a very close childhood friend of his, a cellist, an accomplished cellist, but nevertheless not so accomplished that he should have had as much money and the kind of assets that he had. So it raises questions about whether he may have been holding them for Putin or not, but there's no evidence. And, it's a question of whether they were in violation, or the cellist was in violation of Russian law, so that's really up to Russia. I think, we can point to, there are many other examples and things that we can point to with regard to Russia and their kind of crony capitalism. We don't have to overplay that one, but certainly I would draw attention to it. For me, it's just another example of the huge disconnect between the elite around Putin, the Kremlin, how wealthy they are, and the rest of Russian society and the Russian people.
Are you surprised by the role or lack thereof that Russia has played in the 2016 presidential cycle?
Yes, and actually, I want to make one other comment though about the money and Putin, because the other common denominator is it's the KGB. So there's a really interesting book a woman named Karen DeWisha wrote about, where she basically lays out, she makes a very strong case for the fact, or an argument that the crew, Putin and his gang, all these KGB folks, they came into power basically wanting to take over the government and the entire economic system. So if you have time to read it, it's actually quite informative. And so that's I think the thing that people need to understand about the way Russia works. It's basically this KGB, FSB apparatus running everything and enriching themselves. Okay, so the question about Russia not playing such a big role in the elections, I am surprised. I mean, even in 2012, when, now I feel badly because I also was not taking so seriously when Mitt Romney said, that Russia's the greatest threat. I also kind of laughed, and I was in a position of authority in the, at that point, in the Pentagon, yes. And I was like, well, Russia's not the biggest threat. And now I think he was right. So, but even that was pretty much it on Russia. And then the president had his great comeback. It's the 1980s calling for their foreign policy back. Except sadly, as I mentioned with INF, the script for that, the playbook, is going to be probably to do the same thing we did in the 80s, which is threaten the Russians, actually be ready to deploy, and then they'll back down. So it's horrible. It's appalling. I mean, it's sad. We really shouldn't be here. It's not good for the Russian people either in Russia. But I do predict that will change as we get into the general election. I don't know why it hasn't been more of an issue, or that foreign policy hasn't been more of an issue, because, boy, if you made it more of an issue, some of well, at least the people I support would do. She would do well. But I mean, it should be something. I mean, I think for all the candidates, we should know. But even, I don't know what Bernie Sanders thinks about Russia, and I mean, I'll be honest, as a Democrat, I should have some idea, but I don't. I don't know who advises him on these things. So I think that somehow the media did not do a good job kind of forcing these candidates to really tell us more about what they would do in the international arena.
Yeah, my question is about what is Putin's view of our candidates as someone who comes across as a strong personality, someone who is not embracing of ethnic and minority diversity and respect for across the sexes. How is he going to deal with someone? We have an African American president. We have a woman who is a candidate for president. How are we going to deal with him?
So on our current president, I think he has respect for him, but he definitely has a different view about the use of force, and Putin definitely pays attention to a different kind of strength than the one that Obama has. But I think in some ways Putin's wrong. In some ways I've argued that we do a little bit more, and so I would argue, we could make our president, and he could make himself stronger. But I don't think that Putin has no respect for him. What makes Putin mad is that he doesn't feel that Obama, I sense that he maybe doesn't feel that our president has enough respect for him, or doesn't pay enough attention always, and then he tries to get our attention, which in that way it's similar to North Korea. With regard to Donald Trump, okay, Putin said something like, well, he's, I forget what he said. He did not call him brilliant, but he called him, he said something complimentary. But I don't know that Putin really loves Donald Trump, and frankly, those two would not get along, because I think they're too similar. You can't have two people like that in one room. They'd get into a macho kind of struggle, so I don't see that working. Obviously, if Trump were president, we'd figure out a way not to have it lead to war, but they wouldn't be buddy-buddy. With Clinton, we know that he does not love her by any means. We know he's sexist, yes. And he's made comments about Clinton that put her down, that used her gender. But I think that he would respect her because, and I mean, I have a bit of a bias because I've worked with her, but she's also quite strong, and she's strong on what she says about Russia. And in 2012, actually, I don't know if people remember, because it was actually leaked. She didn't say it on purpose to the media. She was talking to some NGO people, NGO representatives, and she said, you know, I feel like what Putin's doing is he's recreating the Soviet Union, the Soviet influence. He's recreating it. And this was 2012. And then it leaked, and it caused this big furor, and the Russians never forgave her for that. So that would be, there'd probably be a little more rhetoric, like not nice, how should I say it? You know, Obama keeps it cool. He doesn't insult the guy, although he'll say he's like a slouchy schoolboy, which is kind of an insult. So it's a different kind of insult. Again, like I said, he gives them the sense, like, I don't need to worry about you. Because Russia's a declining power, you know, smaller. But actually, the declining powers are the most dangerous, and that, I think, Clinton does understand. Cruz. I don't know what Putin would think of Cruz. You know, I haven't followed even very much what Cruz has said about Russia, but my sense is that probably it wouldn't be that different from Clinton, except there wouldn't be the gender thing. Who else am I leaving out? Bernie Sanders. I think he wouldn't have, I mean, I don't know what he would think of Bernie Sanders. Probably, it's hard to tell. I don't think he'd like him. He wouldn't like his economic policies, for sure. He wouldn't want those coming anywhere near Russia. So, you know, crony capitalism he likes. Am I leaving out a candidate? Oh, Kasich. Oh, Kasich, I mean, he's pretty middle of the road, reasonable. He would probably keep down the rhetoric. So he probably would be, you know, a guy Putin would feel like he could work with. And, you know, I don't know enough about Kasich's foreign policy, but my sense is he might be more like George H.W. Bush, I'm guessing.
I know I've got 3 more questions. 1, 2, 3. If there are more, I'll come to you in just a second.
In the 90s, one of the things we proposed to Russia, we advanced with Russia, was the NATO-Russia Council. This was a way we were supposed to bring Russia into the world that was emerging in the post-Cold War period. It has probably failed miserably. We also used it as a sanction by stopping activity of the NATO-Russia Council whenever we didn't like something Russia was doing, when maybe it should have been a place where we could continue talking. How do you see Russia relationship with NATO and through that with the United States moving forward?
So the NATO-Russia Council, yes, as you mentioned, I think it was founded in '97, and the idea was, let's work together with Russia. Now, it was based on something called the founding, I think it's the Founding Act, which laid out that we and Russia, we subscribe to the same principles: sovereignty, rights for minorities, and, you know, human rights, etc. And as a result, the NATO agreed not to permanently station substantial forces in the eastern new part of NATO, and that they would meet periodically and hold this council meeting. I think it's interesting. I think you're right, because they have used it as a sanction. They just met last week, and the meeting sounds like it did not go well. It was just a place where they could exchange views rather than in front of cameras in one room. I actually think there's usefulness in that. I think that the council should meet, the council should exist. I, however, personally have called in my writings for getting rid of the Founding Act, because I feel like Russia violated the NATO-Russia Founding Act, and so therefore we shouldn't be bound to the restrictions on basing either, and it would be a good signal to Russia. I mean, they deserve it, they broke it. The argument on the other side, which I'm not hard over on this, because the argument on the other side is, well, let's just keep it, because at some point we'll get back to cooperating with Russia, and as long as we ignore also the parts that keep us bound, I'm okay with that, I guess. I mean, I do think, though, that it's better to have clarity, you know, moral clarity and political clarity, and say, you guys violated it, so we're going to consider it abrogated, we'll have to negotiate a new one. But I think meeting in the Russia Council, I don't see any harm in that, as long as it's not used as a media circus for the Russians to pretend that all is normal again, that they're not going to be under sanctions and we're going to work together across the board. Because the big danger is that we sell out Ukraine, you know, and that we don't stick to them and get the Russians to reverse their actions. And I should add one other thing. There's another channel where we talk, military to military. It's a U.S. channel, and that's very useful. Once a year, the Incidents at Sea conference, where they talk also about the air incidents above the sea. And as you know, as you alluded to recently, there were some real serious unprofessional air flights over U.S. ships. Those things will be discussed military to military, and that's absolutely essential, I think.
How do you view the unity against Putin, particularly like with the EU and with NATO? Any fractures or disunity?
Well, there is disunity in NATO in those countries that do business with Russia, that want to keep a strong relationship with Russia. You see Austria, which is not a member of NATO, but they try to keep this closer diplomatic and economic relationship with Russia, although they are EU members, they've got to hold to the sanctions. But they don't isolate Putin as much diplomatically, for example. And then within the NATO context, the Czechs, Slovaks, Hungarians, they also tend to take less of a hard line towards Putin. And so the Kremlin will try to peel off allies, but they've stuck together. They've stuck together when it mattered on sanctions, on the European Reassurance Initiative, again, which I mentioned as exercises, etc. So, you know, so far the alliances have held. But the Russians look for every excuse. And they also try to do it internally. So in Germany, for example, you may know the chancellor, of course, is from the more conservative party, and she herself has a very clear-eyed, strong, kind of more hawkish view of Putin, whereas the Social Democrats, which are in coalition with her, so her foreign minister is a Social Democrat, they take a softer view. They just want to cooperate with Russia. Let's do economic stuff. And Germany's stronger when it's together with Russia. This is a long-standing strain of thought in German politics. So the Russians will also try to play into that. And then you heard my example with the migrants, which, you know, if you weaken Merkel, then you're strengthening the other side.
I have two questions. I'm curious first if any of the security that was at the Olympics in Sochi, those troops moved from there into the Crimea to make that they were used as after the Olympics were over. And the second question is, given that President Obama just said in that interview with Charlie Rose that looking back in the history of Russia feeling threatened and the Soviet Union feeling threatened because so many borders were exposed, why are we commencing maneuvers in Poland, military maneuvers in Poland? Can you defend that?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so on the first question, okay, now I've already forgotten it. The Sochi. That's a good question. Probably if I knew that, I couldn't tell you, but it's not out of the realm of the possible. So I will actually go and Google and see what there is out there. But it is not out of the realm of the possible given the geography. But I would say probably not super likely, because the SNAP exercise that was held was military, and most of the forces in and around Sochi were not military. They were internal security and the internal intelligence forces. So it's probably not likely that there was much overlap, the more I think about it. On the Polish exercise, so in June there's going to be an exercise, and again, we've telegraphed this, I think, a year in advance almost, that there's going to be a big exercise that Poland's hosting. It's a multinational exercise, meaning many countries are participating, in fact about 24, and the amount of, but it's not a NATO exercise, so it's just Poland's exercising and they're inviting everyone. and 25,000 troops are going to be there. So for NATO countries, that's the biggest we've had so far. Thus far, every exercise we've done has been on the order of like 7,000. Again, and on the Russian side, it's been like hundreds of thousands, or at least 100,000. So this is a big exercise. The Russians will take notice, and it's fairly close to, it's within weeks of the summit. But it's deterrence. It's demonstrating to the Russians that we as an alliance, that our military is ready if they do anything foolish, that they'll have to deal with the NATO alliance. And so therefore it's aimed at making the Russian military and their political leadership stop and think twice about taking any action against NATO countries.
So I know they've got a few more questions, and we're going to try to do these quick. We want to be respectful of the hour and people's time. I do want to, we've got a number of students that are here, and I wonder, Evelyn, you've had a tremendously successful career in international relations. What kind of advice do you have to students who might be thinking about a career in the international community or in international relations more specifically?
Well, get out of the United States. Learn a foreign language, or
forever, or just
Oh. No, I mean, if you want to be in the field, as soon as possible, get some international experience. That will also help you figure out whether you really want to do that. Like everything in life, get real, learn a language, and I think just always ask for opportunities. One of my formative experiences was I was right out of college. I was working through a placement agency. I got a job at the Council on Foreign Relations, which I don't know whether it would happen anymore, but it's like the #1 international relations think tank based in New York City. So I got a job there, and then I heard, oh, they're planning a trip to Hungary, and I'm Hungarian American. So I happen to have been born with a different language, so for me it was easy to say learn another language, but I learned other ones in high school. And I went down to the vice president's office, and I introduced myself. So the guy had no idea who I was. And I said, I hear you're going to Hungary, and I speak fluent Hungarian, and maybe I can come and help you on the trip, And it was a small enough organization. I don't know how they let me in to introduce myself and ask this thing. And my colleague had said to me, there's no way they're going to let a junior person go. And he looked at me, and he was very frugal, and he said, oh, we don't have enough funding money, I don't know, it's kind of stammering because I took the guy completely off guard. And I made a quick calculation. I knew at that time, in 1989, that a plane ticket to Hungary round trip was $600. But I had no idea where they would stay and what a hotel cost. So I just said, well, I'd be willing to pay for my airfare. And that is a lesson because it shows that you care enough that you're willing to put your own skin in the game. And so he kind of looked at me and said, well, let me check. And the bottom line is he paid for the whole thing, the airfare, the hotel, and the hotel we stayed like right on the Danube, so there's no way I could have afforded it. So it's like just ask, get out there, and bug people to help you along the way.
That's good advice.
Thank you. What's Russia's current relationship with China? What will its future relationship will be? And if there's major escalation in the South China Sea, what will Russia do with China?
Okay, on the last one, I don't think the Russians want to get involved in anything between us and China that's military or that jeopardizes relationships they have in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Vietnam, I'm thinking, and others. So that I think it's pretty certain the Russians will try not to get involved in anything like that. But on their relationship with China, it is the $60,000 question, and it's really what's important. In my view, Russia's the threat right now. Russia's what we need to be concerned with because they're challenging us in the international order right now. But I actually think medium term we need to be looking at China because China could become a threat if we don't manage China properly. Now, I actually am one of the people who believes that it's not a foregone conclusion that we'll be at odds with China. A lot depends on what happens internally in China, because right now, of course, their military is preeminent. They're quite dominant within their system, challenging the party, and there's a question of where China goes in terms of their internal democracy, et cetera. but I think that's the one we need to be working on. But unfortunately, because Russia's challenging us right now, we're forced to deal with Russia in the short term, as well as terrorism. So Russia right now, they're using China to say to the rest of the world, well, fine, you want to sanction us? We'll do business with China. And they're kind of pretending to have an equal relationship with China, and the Chinese are kind of letting them pretend, although not really, because they apparently took them to the cleaners on this oil deal that they made, oil or gas, anyway, the energy deal they made recently, or last year. I think that the Russians who are really thinking strategically, and even the Russian military, they know that they have to worry about China over the long run, not Europe. It's the Chinese that are trying to buy real estate, in Russia. It's the Chinese that are growing their nuclear forces. So I think that the competitor down the line for Russia will be China, and that's why I always argue in the long run, Russia's going to have to get closer to Europe and to us, and the sooner they realize it, the better.
Kind of got two questions here. One is, I always view anything Russia does as kind of against the United States. But if I were a Russian citizen, an old retired guy, reasonably secure with some worldview, would I think Putin and Russian policy was good for Russia, and would I think it ultimately would be good for me as a citizen of Russia? The other question is, you're something of a linguist, and I see Hungarian. Are you Hungarian?
So I'm Hungarian-American, meaning I was born and raised here, but my parents came over from Hungary after 1956, so they left during the revolution. So that does color my view about democracy and, responding to challenges towards democracy and European security. On the other question of if you're the average retired Russian, do you think that Putin is good for Russia and good for you? I think the answer is yes, because you believe the promises he's made to you, that he's going to continue to pay your pension and maybe he'll give you more, and you think that the fact that you're suffering right now because of inflation is because of the Westerners and because of the sanctions. So, or maybe, and then other problems that you have, like the corruption you see, you blame on your local, your local government, you don't blame it on Putin. Because you see, with Putin, he's like strutting on the world stage and Russia's important again, and so that gives you a feeling of pride, so all that's natural. It's just that they've manipulated, using the media, the Russian people's perception of what's real and what's not.
Yeah, time for one more here.
So, can you hear me?
Yes.
So my question is, if we stay in this status quo, like just the same way, when do you think that's gonna last? Is it like a matter of when resources will be over for, what is like the strategy going forward? I'm also asking is because I come from Bulgaria, and the community is kind of split between pro-Russia and pro-West, and it's hurting internally a lot. So just because we're very dependent on Russia's resources, but also we are like NATO alliance, and I'm just curious about that.
Yeah. No, I think that's a question that's really hard for me to answer, so I've tried answering variants of your question tonight, how long will Putin stay in power and who will replace him? So I think that this situation is going to remain for a while, unfortunately, because in answer to the other question about the opposition, I see the opposition as weak. Unless something changes where more of those truck drivers and, other people who are going to come under more economic pressure, unless they, suddenly acknowledge or understand, again, I don't know what's actually going on, whether they don't understand, or they understand but they don't want to acknowledge. But until they say, okay, enough, I don't think you're going to get change. And that could happen. I can't predict that. That could happen at any moment. But, as somebody who spent most of my career now in the government, which means you kind of figure out what the safe bet is, the safe bet is that unfortunately it's going to stay like this for a while. But, you know, that's why I want us to be strong, because I want the sooner we can show to Russia that this isn't going to work, the better. And I think the place we do it is in Ukraine. You know, we get them to back out of eastern Ukraine, and then Crimea will still have to also be resolved. And then hopefully in Syria we can get a compromise, because I do see Putin understanding that we're not leaving militarily, but he's also not leaving militarily now, and his response has been to ramp it up.
We are at that moment where we've got to say goodnight. Before we do, though, I want to share just a little breaking news for you that, according to CNN, Donald Trump has won Pennsylvania, Connecticut, and Maryland, with Kasich coming in second in Connecticut. Clinton took Connecticut and Maryland, and the rest have not yet been called. So a little foretaste of what you get to look forward to when you get home and turn on the TV tonight.
You have depressed all of you, perhaps.
Well, I want to thank you, Evelyn, for really just a remarkable, candid conversation and sharing your experience and expertise with us. Thank you. Thank you very much.